So it's now the tea break, coffee break next door, and then in 30 minutes we'll move on to the highlight of the afternoon with Professor Laurentjoye's interim report.
Thank you for your time, Richard.
next year for the final report of his project. What I'm going to say is that the report is now available. Got copies here. It's 44 pages or something, or quite a little bit technical, but it gives you the sort of detail that the SNP's white papers have not provided. And if you would like to get a copy of the first purchasers, since it's not been available before today, then it'll be available at the registration desk either the rest of today and also tomorrow at a bargain basement price of £10. So with that, I will hand over to Ian.
Thank you, Tim. For those of you who were here last year, you'll know that my background is in banking, 40 years career banker. Specialism in the latter part of my career was in payments. I was director of Switchcard Services. I was also the UK's sole director on MasterCard's Global Advisory Board for all things debit cards. So it's with that background that I was invited to join the Scottish Currency Group, because payments are a critical factor in their move to independence. So that's my background. The one thing I would say is I hope you've all enjoyed the conference to date. Last year we did the how of setting up a Scottish currency. It's not that difficult. This year the focus has been on the why. And I think you'll agree with me that we've had some fantastic ideas. In fact, we could have called the Conference of Ideas, because that's really what we're interested in doing. We're not interested in issuing a currency just for the sake of it. We're interested in creating a currency to benefit the people of Scotland as we move forward. Now, the actual developing a currency plan for Scotland, in the more mundane sense, we meet every fortnight. The small group of people, dedicated volunteers, none of us are paid for the work we do. And my own involvement has been over the last 4 years. And the work plan we've had since I last addressed you last year, we've been, and I must mention this, we've just launched a new website, which I'd encourage you all to look at. Website that we're very, very happy with the new website. It's interactive, and thanks to all the team on the currency group, excluding myself, because as you can see, I still work from paper, but thankfully there are many more people much more capable than I am in new technology. So the website has been one of our key deliverables over the last 12 months. The other one, of course, is planning for conference. Tim has done a great deal of work in that and pulled together a fantastic number of people to present here. And of course, the big event for us all in the currency group has been commissioning Professor Laurentjoye to do this research into what would be the most beneficial currency proposition for an independent Scotland. The other things that we've been doing over the last years are influencing the movement. Tim mentioned our Facebook page, and we actually talk to branches, and we're quite happy to talk to anybody who's interested, preferably by Zoom, because like myself, I live in Isle of Skye, so even to get the Central Belt takes me 6 hours, so I could actually fly to Lanzarote quicker than I could actually come to any meeting. We're happy to do it by Zoom, and so that's the sort of thing we've been doing. It's fair to say that our collective thinking on a Scottish currency isn't to create a mini version of the United Kingdom. So it's also fair to say that the bond markets might be significantly frightened by some of the suggestions and some of the ideas that we have for an independent Scotland. I mean, things like, in fact, I must actually quote this, because anybody that wants an insight into what is of interest to the general public should always ask their taxi driver. It is actually, I don't know if it's actually true, but I believe it or not, I still have unionist friends, ex-bankers, and that's not easy. But one of them actually worked for Better Together, and he claims that Alistair Darling came up with the idea to say to Alex Salmond, no, you can't share the pound, after talking to his taxi driver on the way to that meeting. It may be true, it may be not, but that's what he said. Anyway, it was my wife Irene, when she's coming to the conference this morning, the taxi driver asked her what's going on in the conference centre. And Irene explained what it was. The taxi driver volunteered. Independence. Oh no. Oh, I've heard my parents talk about this. Oh no, they're too feared. They're feared. They're wondering about what's going to happen to their pension and what's going to happen to ASDA. So, let's put things in perspective. We can have all the very intellectual discussions we want and all the rest of it, but if we really want to convince the ordinary person who need to vote for us, we have to bring it down to a situation that they can see that they will get a benefit. No, ASDA will stay in Scotland. It could be a separate company. And by the way, we're going to increase your pension. That's the answer. And that's the sort of thing we need to actually have. And that's what we work on in the Scottish Currency Group. Another interesting topic we've discussed in the Currency Group is mortgages. I've got 2 daughters. Their biggest concern as being young people is the cost of their mortgage and interest rate. Well, why don't we actually offer from the Central Bank of Scotland a fixed rate interest mortgage for 30 years? We could do that. People will say, oh no, can't do that. Yes, we can. With our own currency, we could do that. And it's not something new, because my long-departed father-in-law, he actually had a 2.5% mortgage from Annan District Council on his former council house. So district councils in Scotland used to offer this in the pre-Thatcher era. So this is not something new. This is something that we could do. It's something we could go into a campaign and say, right, young people, vote for us. This is what we can do. In terms of industry, public ownership, Robin McAlpine, William, everybody agrees we need to bring the actual manufacturing jobs back to Scotland, using the assets of Scotland, and that means taking public ownership. So these are sort of things we discuss. And by the way, I think now somebody mentioned central bank. The first thing we should put in terms of the perspective for the Scottish Central Bank is an obligation to create full employment. Central banks sometimes have that, and for us to rebuild Scotland, we can make a commitment to full employment, because we're going to have to invest hugely in infrastructure. We're going to have to go into a deficit to do that, but we're going to fund that deficit from our own currency. And finally, my last own point before I introduce Thibault is we talked about the location of the central bank and the civil service departments. Well, my suggestion is the central bank will be based in Glasgow. The civil service departments will be in Dundee. The last place they're going is Edinburgh. Let's put them into the yes cities, the cities that backed independence, Glasgow and Dundee. Well, that's me. I'll just read from, it's my privilege as chair of the Banking and Finance Group to be able to introduce our next guest, who is Professor Thibault Laurentjoye from Aalborg University in Denmark. Thibault is in fact French, but teaches in Denmark. And as Tim said, he's an internationally recognized expert in monetary and exchange rate economics. He actually strangely came to our attention when we stumbled across a paper that he had been commissioned to do for the Welsh Senate, looking at currency options for an independent Wales, believe it or not. And that document, that commission came from the Labour government of Wales. Can you imagine the Scottish Labour government commissioning such a paper? That's what Welsh Labour did. So this is a keynote address. It is an interim report, as Tim mentioned. It's an interim report, and we're hoping that we'll have the full report next year. And once we have the full report, we see that as being the basis to address the GERS, which is the annual fiasco supported by the Scottish Government. And hopefully we're going to have a counter narrative to that. So can I introduce Thibault? Thank you.
Check. Is the mic on? All right. So, my name is Thibault Laurentjoye. I'm actually newly associate professor at Aalborg University in the north of Denmark. And as Tim and Ian explained, I was commissioned by the Senate of Wales a couple of years ago as part of a panel of experts to work on what would happen institutionally in an independent Wales. And for those of you who attended the conference last year, I intervened online, first day in the morning. So two things about that. The first one is I'm fully aware that last year my presentation was probably a little bit overkill in terms of content and density. I was probably a little bit frustrated about not having been able to officially present in the Welsh context because the event had been cancelled at the last minute for political reasons. And I'm kind of sorry if I took some of you as collateral victims. The second thing is that I don't want to repeat myself compared to what I said last year. So the video is online. I watched it. I think it's pretty understandable. The report for Wales is online. In this, which is divided in 5 parts, the first 8, so the first part, the first 8 pages are a digest of the Welsh report for the Scottish audience. So for those of you who have read, feel free to ask questions after my presentation. My idea here is to first, I'm mindful that I'm intervening at the end of the day. You've already had to incorporate a lot. I know that when I'm at conferences, obviously the attention span diminishes as the day goes, so I'm not going to try and make you enter a semi-coma. All right, I will try and be entertaining, and I will kind of use this as a sort of a runway to take off and maybe expand a little bit the horizon. So what this report and associated presentation is not about, as Ian explained, it's not the finished version. It's not an overall policy plan or suggestions. This will need further work, including going through some of the official documents, including, for instance, the Scottish input-output tables, which, however incomplete, partial, questionable they might be, are nonetheless interesting. This will be part of what will be presented next year. And in general, my idea is not to provide anybody with something, well, take it or leave it. You know, I'm going to tell you because I know better, and I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. Obviously, we're in a democracy for better and worse. And the philosophy here is to just give you and give the general public information and, well, make of it what you want. My goal will be to try and, if not convince you, at least maybe change maybe some of your perspective on certain issues. So obviously today we'll talk about currency and we'll talk about monetary aspects. And this being said, feel free to ask any questions, and I'll be very happy to expand a little bit further if just mindful of the people over here, right? Yes, user experience, very important. Okay, so now let's imagine that in 2014, Scotland voted yes to become independent. Okay, so you probably feel a lot of joy. You know? Retrospectively, you think, oh my God, that would have been so amazing. It would certainly have been. Like, I don't have a skin in the game, right? So I don't have skin in the game. So I understand that how people would have found it amazing. But let's say, perhaps 5 years later, let's say pre-pandemic, because maybe the pandemic would have elicited exceptional responses that could have, in a way, benefited Scotland. But with an incomplete currency framework, Scotland would have likely, sooner or later, hit a kind of wall. So you would like to invest in infrastructure to obviously redynamize the country, get maybe more people to move back to Scotland from the UK. Well, at some point or others, you would have been hitting, stumbling upon liquidity requirements. That would have hampered your ability to invest. You would have had to delay plans. People would have been frustrated. The cost of borrowing would have gone up. You wouldn't have been able, without a central bank issuing its own currency, you wouldn't have been able to invest on it. You would have ended up like with probably quite stringent financial conditions. And maybe at some point, we told you it wouldn't work. Okay, obviously, I don't know. Maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm just trying to shock you, and maybe it worked. But it's a possibility. Okay, it is a possibility. All right, so for better and worse, take the opportunity of, well, having missed the first attempt to reflect on what could have been done best. And definitely one thing that could have been done best is on the currency side. I mean, frankly. And now, when I worked on Wales, I looked at what had been written, but I sort of selected to inform my understanding. Obviously, this time, preparing this report, so this is part 2 of the report, there's a 4-page survey of what's been said. Okay, it is not exhaustive because, for instance, Commonweal have issued many papers on the topic. I selected the 2018 report, which was my actually main source of influence on my work on Wales. But you can see how, for instance, Ronald MacDonald, 2013, 2014, 2022, Ian Hardy in 2022, basically academics all said, well, Scotland needs its own currency. Think tanks, Commonwealth, Scotonomics, Scotland needs its own currency. Like pretty much everybody said it, except the Scottish government. All right, now, there are precedents about that, about politicians and technocrats kind of creating their parallel reality, you know, in making up stuff on the basis of existing theories and recombining them like Frankenstein. There was something called the Emerson Report in 1991. The European Commission decided to have, well, quite good, young, relatively mainstream economists. They took the optimum currency area theory, part 5 of my report, which Mark Carney, by the way, used in 2014. But in 1991, they used the optimum currency area theory. They butchered it, recombined it in a meaningless way to show why it was so important for the Maastricht Treaty to go through. And basically what they did is they created this false narrative whereby economic shocks were only the result of policies. And they literally concluded, well, basically, the secret is, let's not have governments intervene. Well, that's brilliant. I mean, today we see it. Europe is completely lagging behind the US, and I'm not talking about the gigantic gap between Europe and China. Because for those of you who don't know, China is now dominating the world, or over 80% of serious technologies, okay, especially future-related technologies. So, if I had to put it in one sentence, the fundamental flaw at the center of the Scottish government vision, or maybe absence of vision, is that continuity does not equal stability. And I find that from a sort of philosophical, like implicit hypothesis perspective, they always assumed, okay, if we display continuity, that provides stability, we acquire credibility. By the way, Starmer government very much follows that philosophy. You see, it's really like, let's be as weak as we can, you know, until people trust us to be powerful. Well, you know, just if you know any precedents in history where that worked, you know, feel free to, you know, drop me an email. So the idea that keeping currency arrangements unchanged after independence would bring stability and credibility has absolutely zero ground. Okay, there is obviously, yes, you could cite the Emerson report or, you know, things like that, of course. But like, here's the thing: you put the assumptions that you want, you know, to get to the conclusions that you intend. Okay, sure. Seriously, starting from reality, no, doesn't work. And on the contrary, not adapting to circumstances would be a market, and markets know that. So you think you'd be acquiring credibility, markets would be like looking at you like, well, you're obviously naked and you're pretending that, you know, you were in a, you know, king costume. Like when the seasons change, you don't wear the same clothes, okay, unless you, I don't know, you have really no, you know, feeling of temperature, or I don't know. But we change clothes, okay? We adapt to circumstances. It's just normal, okay? That's what provides stability. It's the ability to adapt to changes in circumstances. The idea that you should keep the same currency framework when you change, or you want to change your political framework, is quite farcical. There's plenty of evidence that having your own currency increases your policy space. I'm not a massive fan of the expression policy space, but I'll use it because it's kind of customary to use, so maybe some of you will find it easy to understand. Now, usually, in the debate around particular exchange rates, people tend to focus on monetary policy. Okay, I developed more than part in last year's talk, but just know that what is also important in having your own currency is not just about the exchange rate, it's that ultimately your central bank will act as a backstop when there are tensions on your government, in your government markets. Okay, it will provide liquidity when needed. That's exactly what Greece would have needed in 2010. So I took some numbers that just to give you an idea, because honestly, it's not always very easy to measure. You will have few issues, but one way of looking at it, so you take GDP, so GDP per capita in purchasing power parity. So, sorry, there's a spelling mistake. So purchasing power parity means that we try to make up for the fact that the same good will be worth different prices across different countries. So Norway is a very expensive country. Let's say Lesotho is likely to be a less expensive country. Okay, so the same good you buy in Norway and Lesotho will not have the same price. To make up for that, we use purchasing power parity. Okay, so this being taken into account, okay, it means that we're kind of comparing things comparable. Ecuador and El Salvador are two Latin American countries, okay, who dollarized. Okay, I think the most interesting case is Ecuador. They renounced their currency, the sucre, in 2000. Because, well, they faced hyperinflation. Okay, this is undeniable. There was an issue. The management of macroeconomic management of the country was problematic. Now, if you take Argentina, for instance, and we could talk a lot about Argentina, especially Argentina now, but what's interesting is that in the 80s, when they encountered hyperinflation, like several Latin American countries, why, by the way? Because they, in the first place, they overborrowed in US dollar. Okay, that was the crux of the issue. But they encountered hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, by the way, is not 20 or 30%. Okay, in their case, it was 9,000%. You know, in like 89. Okay, but serious stuff. Weimar was like 100 million%. Like prices were multiplied by a million in 1923. Like when people say 100% inflation, okay, it's high inflation. It's not hyperinflation. It's really different. But Argentina in the 80s. Finished with hyperinflation. What did they do? They pegged their currency against the US dollar using a system called the currency ball. But they retained their currency. It was mimicking very precisely the dollar. It was even 1 peso for $1. But at the end, they decoupled. They were able to decouple from the dollar because they had retained their own currency, their own unit of account. As Richard was saying, money is fundamentally a unit of account. And the problem with Ecuador is that they renounced their currency, and now they're finding it unbelievably hard to re-implement it. In 2017, Rafael Correa, who was the previous president of Ecuador, tried. He couldn't. He couldn't because there was, well, some people in the population prefer to have the dollar, usually established interests. And in general, it's very hard when people have the memory of the domestic currency being associated with instability, then you get rid of it, things stabilize from a nominal perspective. They might not want to reintroduce it, okay? And it's actually not only did it fail, but in 2023, the IMF had Ecuador sign a memorandum whereby they said officially that they were not going to try and reissue their own currency. So Ecuador, we could talk about El Salvador, who some of you know now also accepts Bitcoin, as well as prisoners from the USA that Trump is illegally deporting. Those two guys are in that situation, okay? So they grew, okay? I'm not saying it just completely kills them. People's, oxygen disappears and, all form of life, is ancient history. No, but it hampers your abilities, and particularly anything investment related, which will require at some point huge investment and tensions on liquidity, is going to be discouraged. Because markets will react, and unless you can mobilize long-term benevolent, almost, liabilities, it's going to be hard. So, if I had to take a metaphor, using someone else's currency is like having a whole family live in a 500 square feet property with the inability to move the walls. Okay, it's doable. It's not exactly fantastic. using your own currency is like having a bigger place that you can expand, and on top of that, there's an outside, right? That's basically the difference. Okay, so the question is, what do you want for Scotland? Do you want to be this kind of dwarfed nation that remains dependent on the UK? Well, that's cool. Keep the pound. That's absolutely fine. I mean, if you're fine with that, go for it. If you're a little bit ambitious, if you think, well, Scotland has its own identity, deserves to be in charge of its destiny, and I'm not saying it comes at no cost, and there will be no effort in the process, but you need to go for your own currency. Like, that's necessary. Like, yes, you could earn, like, Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? So if you're realistic about it, you need your own currency. Now, a point, that's part 3 of the report, formal versus informal currency unions. So if you remember, the 2014 official position of the Scottish government was to have a formal currency union with the rest of the UK, whereas it's in the 2018 that officially they said, well, we'll have temporary standardization, which is an informal union, informal currency union. Now, apart from the fact that the UK government said, get lost, would this have been better? Because you can legitimately ask, well, but, hypothetically, if the UK had said, okay, all right, let's have this formal currency union, wouldn't it have been a better option? And, well, that's worth asking. Yeah, definitely. Why not? Well, just remember one thing. Scotland, England, okay? In terms of votes, unless they go European style where, one country equal one vote, which, by the way, has other issues, but it's not the debate. But, okay, it's very likely that Scotland, plus Wales, plus whoever wanted to have their own currency, would not, in a formal currency union, effectively, they would not have a voice, okay? Now, let me introduce you to the Greek trap, because there's a precedent of a country that goes to hell in a formal currency union, okay? So, what I call the Greek trap, which, by the way, is a concept I wrote in the first version of the Welsh report. But the problem was I was a little bit too critical of the European Union. I'm French, and I think my country did not exactly benefit from the euro area. That's obviously why I became a specialist on the optimum currency area theory. But the concept fell off the report. And I only realized recently, and I thought, that's really a loss, because that was actually one of the starting points, and I was actually quite pleased with it. So I thought, well, I'll definitely make it in that one. So that's why part 3 is internal versus external adjustment, avoiding the Greek trap. So what is the Greek trap? It's a situation when you're part of a formal currency union and the monetary authorities stop being cooperative. It's literally that, okay? All right, there'll be a few pictures. So this dark blue line is the same metric as what I showed before, with the different countries. So it's the GDP per capita of Greece. So this is the financial crisis. This is austerity. So you can see a bit of a drop. Okay, in PPP terms, it was actually worse in nominal terms, but that's a serious drop. You don't have many instances in recent data, okay, except countries at war or experiencing very damaging earthquakes or natural. This is completely exceptional, this kind of drop, okay, especially in a European country. This is the rate of unemployment in right-hand scale. So the rate of unemployment went from overall just under 10% to over 25, nearly 30%. What I'm not showing here is that it disproportionately fell on young people and on women, okay? It was an absolute disaster. Socially, it was absolutely terrible. And, well, we could even add that the people that were, quote unquote, at the core of the problems of Greece, particularly the ship owners, were virtually untouched by any of the measures. So it was, from a fairness perspective, zero. Now, this is the public debt to GDP ratio in purple on the right-hand scale, and the primary deficit of the government, which means deficit before payment of interest. I will come back to this one in a second. But just that, okay? what was the point of austerity in Greece? Oh, those bloody Greeks, too much debt. You know, we're going to give them a good spanking, and their debt will reduce. Impressive. I mean, that's a beautiful reduction. Okay? Right. This is literally what happened. Why? Well, because maybe you managed to reduce the public debt. We could go in details. It required a haircut on the private creditors. But no, what they really did is they squeezed. Okay? No, I don't want that. Knock, knock. Yes? Okay. Thank you very much. But really what happened is GDP was squeezed. And nominal GDP was squeezed by almost 33%. Okay, it became 2/3 of what it had been just a couple of years before. And that's why it was already too high at around 100%. Well, it just went, nearly 120. Well, it went to 180. Okay, so much, okay, for reducing public debt. All right? Now, if we zoom in a little bit on the details, what happened from the more flow perspective? What happened from the deficit perspective? Well, so that's the crisis, okay? So what happened here? Well, first of all, like anybody, there was a crisis, meaning there will be less tax receipts. You might have to pay more for everything benefit related and so on and so forth. Also remember, Greece is a touristic economy. Okay, so every economy under the sun that was export-led, this applies to Germany as well, suffered more during the GFC than more less export-dependent economies. But Greece was extremely export-dependent through the export of a service called tourism. And it became even more dependent on tourism after the crisis, because that's pretty much was the whole reignition strategy was based upon. But let's leave that aside. Now that figure was very low. Okay, it was a severe deficit, and we could discuss whether some additional percentage were the result of some political constraints. All of these are discussed in part 3 in quite some details. There's a box on the Greek crisis with a lot more detail than I will venture here. But what's interesting is, indeed, the primary deficit improved. And it even translated to a surplus for some years. And if you remember 2015, this is when Varoufakis became the finance minister for 6 months, and he said it. He said, well, virtually right now, Greece has a primary balance turning into a surplus, and same on the current account side. So really, that's when he said, well, we should try and go, he didn't say issue on currency, but he suggested using that fiscal currency, if some of you remember, which is a little bit in between. But interestingly, you can see, in spite of reaching a surplus, the debt kept going up, just because, well, when you've got a debt that high, and also all the way the debt was managed, because what you need to realize is that from this point on, and for several years, most of the Greek public debt was off markets. Okay? So what happened? First, we created the European Financial Stability Fund, the EFSF, okay, to take most of the Greek public debt. Then there were bilateral loans from governments to Greece, okay? So meaning France, Germany, Italy, and then maybe not Italy, but France, Germany would borrow, lend to Greece. Now, they made some money in the process, but the thing is, markets were not facing Greece, okay? At no point did they think, oh, I'm lending to Greece. No, they were lending to France, Germany, and so on. And as I said, it was in 2012. That's why, so this, you see, this micro reduction is because we applied a 50% haircut, okay, to all the government bonds of Greece that were held by private investors. Now, it was, in proportion of the initial debt, it was significant. In proportion of how much the debt had inflated, especially as a proportion of GDP, it became almost insignificant. I mean, for those of you who remember that haircut, like this is what it translated into in terms of reducing the overall public debt. Like much fuss was made about it. This is the reduction. Okay? Now, then they were more or less stable, although they were managing to achieve a surplus. then this is COVID, and since they managed to reduce, now interestingly, they've consistently been above 2%, closer to 3% of inflation. And actually, this is the interesting part, so here I'm showing the primary deficit. Now you need to add the interest, okay? With interest, they're in more negative territory. So actually, if you look here, what you see is that Greece have gone to a more, well, stimulating approach. And that's why their public debt to GDP ratio is finally falling, okay? So the reason why they're finally succeeding is by using the exact tools that had been imposed upon them during the austerity period. And the final thing I want to show about Greece is the interest rate, but I'm not showing the central bank interest rate. I'm not showing the 10-year government yield, which I will show later for a panel of countries. I'm just taking the total interest payments on the public debt, which I divide by the gross public debt. All the data so far is taken from the IMF World Economic Outlook. So after the crisis, as I said, the debt was taken off market. So basically, that's why, that whole period is somewhat weird. It's like, well, it's not really reflective of the underlying situation. But what is really interesting is that when the Greek public debt finally came back to the markets around here, well, it kept declining, and especially here, so 2021 is where it reached the lowest point. That you know what happened? I mean, you probably know what happened at that point. There was something called the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. So the ECB incepted its fifth QE, if you wish, because there had been 4 put together in 2015. They were called the Asset Purchase Programs. And there was a fifth one, which was like a combination of all 4, but smaller scale. But what Lagarde, Christine Lagarde, who was still is the head of the ECB, said is Greece, which was not eligible to central bank purchase, became eligible again because of the pandemic. So what this did is it basically pushed interest rates downwards. And guess what? At this point, rating agencies looked and said, Greece is safe again. So they improved the ratings. Greece became investment grade again. And then financial newspapers titled, you see, after a decade of effort, Greece made it back. No, it's almost single-handedly because the ECB said we're going to purchase Greek public debt again. It's entirely based on eligibility to monetary policy operations, which is why it's important to have your own currency. Now, when you choose to have your own currency, well, you've said something, right? It's better than nothing, but you need to choose your exchange rate regime. So here, consider you're in a restaurant, okay? And I'm just going to give you a series of dimensions, and you can, choose if you want them or not. So typically, what constitutes an exchange rate regime? Well, you can have a parity. You can. You don't have to. Okay, floating regimes don't have it all together. Some countries like Singapore, they use a band. There's no strict central parity. So you can have fluctuation bands. If you make them infinite, it's like floating. Fluctuation bands are typically a limited floating. But again, if you make it infinite, it's like floating. You can decide against how many currencies you want to fix your currency. And actually speaking with Tim over the last days, I was reminded because for some reason I went down the rabbit hole of only considering the pound sterling, but it is definitely something which Wales and definitely Scotland need to consider. Like, how do you want to design your basket? Because through doing that, you actually give much more flexibility to your currency with that newspaper saying, oh, you see, we're collapsing against, yes, but we're following a basket of currencies. So we may be depreciating or devaluing against the pound because, well, the dollar is doing so, okay, or the euro. Then something which, in my opinion, has been completely underrated since it was invented. It was put forward by John Williamson, a British economist, although he said he had read about it in the FT some years prior. It was never reused except in Portugal. It was never reused in European countries, but crawling. Crawling is a series of micro adjustments. So let's say you want to progressively devalue your currency by, let's say, 3% over a year, you can implement, could be monthly, weekly, daily, micro devaluations. Okay? It works quite well because it's readable for markets, and yet you have adjustment. And honestly, I do not understand why it's not been taken up more, because I do find it quite clever. The last point is the degree of information disclosure. Now, most countries do not really play with that. There's a major exception, and that's almost single-handedly why I came to consider it so important, but it's Singapore. Okay, Singapore is the richest country in the world. Okay, so when you look at them, I'm not saying it's all down to the exchange rate, but, well, put it that way, their exchange rate regime is not that terrible, that it prevents them from, being viable economically. But what they do, okay, they don't have a central parity. So they have fluctuation bands. They don't say how wide. They have a currency, a basket of currencies. Sorry? Okay. They have a basket of currencies, which is supposed to be based on trade, but they don't reveal the coefficients. And the bands crawl over time, but they don't reveal the speed of crawl. Okay, so from the external perspective, it's as good as floating, but you do see that they intervene because their foreign exchange reserves move. Okay, so they have a target, they have a framework, and they manage. Clearly, I mean, they're good. So markets trust them. Yet, they provide as little transparency. I mean, they're transparent on the principle. They're not transparent about the details. I think that's quite powerful. Why should you be X-raying yourself all the time for markets who, when they have the occasion, will come to attack you like vultures? So I'm just saying this is one opportunity, and especially in the real transition part where you won't even be dealing with the European Union yet. Why not? So those different dimensions that I showed, this is how what corresponds to them in terms of adjustment practices. So this is the parity adjustment. So this got terrible rap, okay, in Britain. This is typically what Bretton Woods was about, okay. The band adjustment, this is what happened after the EMS, well, not for Britain, but for France, for instance. There was an enlargement of the band width. The last thing is the rate of crawl. So let's say initially you devalue at a certain speed, you can increase the speed of depreciation over time, the series of micro devaluations. A point that I'm not going to make here explicitly, but I talk about in the report, that's part 4. What's the difference between devaluation and depreciation? Devaluation is a political act. So devaluation is this. You take your central parity, typically, or your bands, you move them. Okay, that's devaluation. That's the political act. What is depreciation? So your exchange rate moves, okay, within the bands. The exchange rate has a life of its own. Unless you make the upper bound and the lower bound the same, then there's a zero corridor, meaning the central bank intervenes to keep a purely targeted. It's never really happened in history. Even China, when it was super tight against the US dollar, even Denmark, which is quite tight against the euro, leaves a margin of fluctuation because you kind of get some information from the market which can be useful. So there's always a band. So the exchange rate will move inside the band, okay? Now, this is what depreciation is about. Depreciation is when the exchange rate goes from here to there. So you can have a depreciation without a devaluation. When you have a devaluation, well, there will be an implicit depreciation, okay? But these are two different principles. Devaluation is political. Depreciation is a market phenomenon. Okay? Is that clear? All right. Now, that's just for the fun of it. So I mentioned Ecuador, Salvador already. Something important to emphasize is that UK regions or Eurozone countries taken individually, well, you can say they have a hard fixed regime today, okay? But the UK as a whole or the Eurozone as a whole float, right? So this is what, in my opinion, could be a little bit better when, for instance, the IMF does its classifications, or it's the fact that, and sometimes I would say when we have certain conversations around foreign exchange regimes, and I hear people saying, yes, but France and Germany are floating. Well, the euro area as a whole float, but the extent to which European, German or French actions will have an impact of the exchange rate is somewhat debatable. I mean, they're big, but they're not 50%, the two of them, of the total. area, okay? So it's a little bit more, you need to look at the two levels. So a point that I make, and that's the end of part 4 of the report. So if you take Britain, and I'm very serious about this, if you take Britain, you have in this country, okay, I don't want to get killed, okay, so all right, I'm going to say this country, not this nation, okay, because Scotland is a nation, I'm going to say the country is the UK. Can we agree on that? All right. So just saying that there is unconsciously, in the collective unconscious, there is a tendency in the UK, okay, to completely misunderstand what intermediate rates are about. So let me go back one sec. So these are intermediary regimes, okay? You have hard fixed regimes. At the other end, you have floating. But in the middle, you have a variety of regimes which are called intermediary, which I would argue have a fantastic track record. I mean, Bretton Woods, for most countries, okay, the UK was a little bit the exception. But for many countries, Bretton Woods worked well. Okay, you can say we were extracting from the third world. Okay, all right, I get it. But China, okay, China was not so much extracting from other people at the time, a little bit, but mostly being extracted from. And I mean, they registered a growth which, frankly, is they're the record holder of economic growth over 25 years, for a country that size. And they were using an intermediary regime. Okay, I think there's a real case for intermediary regimes. Now, the problem is that the UK has a bad habit. I will come back to it in a second. So there are two types of considerations when you choose a currency regime. The first one is economic situation. Typically, I would say, beware. If you have a current account deficit, pegging is not a good idea, okay? Because sooner or later, you're going to run out of foreign exchange reserves, and it's going to be acrimonious, but you'll have to devalue, okay? So that's one thing. But the other one is more psychological, and I'm being very serious here, okay? Are you ready to use an intermediate regime as such, okay? Or do you say, oh, yes, it's an intermediate regime, but the way you're behaving is using it like a fixed peg? Because that's exactly, particularly in 67 and 90, that's exactly what the UK has done, okay? And generally speaking, there is, in the UK, okay, if you look at the 20th century, okay, it's a graveyard of like currency mismanagement, but not for the reason that you might think. It's basically a tendency to systematically overvalue the currency and defend it like a badge of honor. Okay, and this happens after the First World War. Oh, we're going to go back to the pre-World War parity. What for? Oh, we're going to destroy 20% of the economic activity in the process. Great stuff. You carry on. So Keynes wrote a few papers and books about that. Then you have Bretton Woods. I mean, who was it? Wilson waited years, and the extent of tax, like fiscal policies put in place to mitigate the pressure on the pound, asking for financial assistance from the Fed, the IMF, all that to defend a blatantly overvalued currency. Why are you doing that? Oh yes, but if we devalue, it's political death. Well, change your political regime, I don't know, or float directly, because no, that's completely silly. Okay, you delay, often it's going to be too little, too late. You've accumulated so many issues that it's not going to fix it on its own. I mean, it's terrible. And then you have the 1990 episode, which I worked upon in my PhD thesis. And before I came to it, I thought it was entirely the fault of Germany. Because at the end of the day, the EMS was a reciprocal pegging regime. Meaning, like, let's say I'm France, you're the UK, we decide to peg reciprocally. So if your currency falls too much against mine, my central bank will buy your currency and you'll be saved. If my currency falls too much against yours, you're going to buy my currency. I should have said you're Scotland and I'm France, but it didn't really happen so far. Hopefully, at some point. Okay, but what happened in 1992? Germany at some point said, get lost. No, but that's true. Like when people say, oh, George Soros, the man that broke the Bank of England. Okay, and by the way, full disclaimer, I was at a YSI workshop on Tuesday, so technically I got money from George Soros indirectly, through the. Okay, No, he didn't break the Bank of England. That's a lie. That's a complete misconception. It's because the German central bank said, no, I'm walking out of this. This is nonsense. I'm not having it anymore. And Soros maybe had insider information. Maybe he read some micro. Maybe he saw that the Bank of England was desperate and was increasing interest rates multiple times during the day, which has never been seen before, never been seen since, okay? Which is the height of despair. Like when markets start seeing you increasing interest rates by 2%, 3%, they think, okay, someone's lacking oxygen there. So basically, what happened, really? The UK joined the EMS at a blatantly overvalued rate. Okay? Germany said, guys, you're going to be uncompetitive. On top of that, you have 7% inflation. We have 3% inflation because this was reunification in Germany. Germans were a little bit sensitive about inflation. They were like, do you know what you're doing? And the UK was like, yeah, of course. Of course we do. We're London and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, what happened in 91? The biggest recession in the post-war period. Do you think it's a coincidence? Of course not. Like you just depress your competitiveness and then you suffer the consequences. Then in 92, not only the economic imbalance was piling up, but Germany was saying, okay, we need a readjustment of pegs. And it culminated at a summit in Bath, England, where Germany said, okay, we need to discuss that. And what happened is on the agenda, it was put like 5th item from the bottom of the list. And maybe half the first 30 items would be discussed. And in effect, Germany left. That was 3 days before Black Wednesday, okay? They left, and they said, okay, those guys are clearly taking and we're not having that anymore, okay? And this is what happened. It's entirely political. But when I read about that, I kind of sided with Germany. Like, yes, at some point, okay, you want to be benevolent, but yeah, when someone is clearly, yes, you shouldn't, there's so much you're going to tolerate. So, but really the main takeaway is, okay, I like intermediate exchange rates. Now, let's be real. If, Scotland, to the extent that it is influenced by the UK, 20th century behavior, is going to remotely misuse regimes like that, well, go for managed float directly. Okay, don't even bother. Don't even consider. Like if the people in charge are going to display that side of misplaced pride, okay, it's not worth it, okay? So some real-world examples. That's where I live. By the way, completely non-generalizable example, okay? Do not try this at home. The only reason why the Danes managed to, well, they fixed, but on top of that, they have a fiscal surplus. Yes, it's because of the current account surplus, so it's trade, but also they accumulated so much assets on the rest of the world that they also have a very positive international income surplus. Okay, so it's like even petromonarchies, well, Jordan being one, but Saudi Arabia does this. Okay, sometimes they are in current account deficit. Okay, Denmark never is. If you look over 30 years, it does this. Okay, and right now we're at 10%. Okay, Norway is at 20. Okay, but Norway is Norway. Now you'll have, so Singapore, huge current account surplus, yes, same, like 20%. They use, as I mentioned, an intermediate, which is almost akin to floating, to be fair, like it's so non-transparent. Then floating, the size of Denmark, because you have a lot, okay? Most countries in the world currently float. But for small countries, it's less the case. Big countries float a lot. But countries like on the smaller side, Norway, Switzerland. Okay. Now, if we go on the other side, so fixed with a current account deficit, you have Djibouti and Jordan. Now, if you understood my previous slide, this is quite unlikely. How do you manage to fix when you have a current account deficit? Because you basically just bleed reserves all the time. There's going to be an issue. Both of these countries benefit from huge levels of, particularly US, foreign direct investment. Okay, like structurally, they're almost like an extension, like a gray extension of the US. All right, so completely exceptional. It's you need strong ties to some powerful country, if possible, US, to manage that. So interestingly, current countries with current account deficit that use an intermediate framework, I didn't find that many. There used to be more. Serbia, for instance. But it's shrunk over time, which I do find very weird. But I found Botswana. Okay, so I decided to put it. In general, I tried to go for, well, more like global North country. But it's worth looking at a country like Botswana, because I would actually argue, don't look at it like, oh, okay, it's an African country. You're sure you want to compare Scotland to an African country, not the same climate or whatever. Yes, you do actually. Because think that if those guys manage it, and they do, it means that it works. Okay? So think about it the other way. Now, arguably, if, especially in light of the UK tendency to, well, to mismanage intermediate regimes, if you think, well, floating is the solution, which, by the way, is the consensus in the literature on Scotland so far. Okay, MacDonald, Hardy, Commonweal, Scotonomics. Then the closer example you will find is New Zealand. Okay, so for those of you who are interested in what the dynamics might look like, well, you can look at New Zealand. Okay, yeah, they float. Fine on the inflation side, it's not too high. It's between 2 and 3%. Unemployment is fine. GDP good. Well, they export commodities. The reason why their current account is in deficit is it's not so much the trade account, it's the international income. So there's a lot of ownership of Kiwi companies that is by foreigners. So they basically have this permanent flow going to the rest of the country. It's pretty worth noting that Scotland is almost exactly in this situation. Okay, so it's extremely likely that yes, the current account deficit will have the same profile as New Zealand. So, and this is something I didn't know. It's over the last months when I was working on the report that I found out about it. Okay, so yes, it may be. It's always good to look at these countries, and definitely, I mean, this one is quite creative, but this is arguably one of the closest looking. I know that they don't border England, which obviously makes quite a big difference, but hey, All right, so how much time do I have? Because this is the end. I've got 4 slides. Okay, all right, we go. All right, so now something that I'm going to do, I'm skipping the last part of the report. So the last part of the report, part 5, is the more academic part. It's about optimum currency areas. So I added it because I realized that Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England in 2014, used the OCA, so optimum currency area framework, okay, to discuss the Scottish case. And this is, well, something I'm an expert of. And when I was working on Wales, I realized one more limitation of the OCA framework, which I did actually present. I almost started with it in last year's presentation, which really, in retrospect, I think I tried to kill the audience. But yeah, so you'll find more detail in that. Part 5 of the report. And if you have any questions, feel free to come to talk to me or write to me. So here, I'm going to jump, and I would have liked to write about it in the report, but I'm going to open a little bit, and maybe it's an avant-goût of next year's report, but definitely it's something in the continuity of what you've seen so far. So it's considerations on central banks and monetary policy. Right, so what I'm going to argue, and I say that so at Aalborg, I've been teaching a course called Financial Instability. Well, it's going to be the 5th year now because I'm permanent, so I'm likely going to teach it again. And financial instability is fascinating. It's like the dark side of economics. Obviously, to understand it, you have to leave most theoretical models on at the doormat because they're not going to be very useful to understand what happens. But something that I realized historically is that when you look at central banks recently, we tend to say, oh, since the great financial crisis, central banks who could either fight inflation or unemployment, well, now they have this new mission. It's financial stability. Or like super cool, let's spend money on marketing people, communication. Oh yeah, we have this great news. No. It's actually the first mission of central banks. Central banks were literally created to maintain financial stability. Like in 1694, when the Bank of England was created, well, it was by the government. It was to tame excesses and speculation. France, Napoleon, and because of the war against France, 1801, Napoleon created the Banque de France because of the war against England and the consequences on the public finances. Okay, so clearly, providing liquidity or managing, generally speaking, liquidity of the government debt market is at the heart of, monetary policy, central banks. That's literally what they do first. In the case of the US, interestingly, the US had two financial crises, 1903, 1907. I think the latter was the one on the copper market, which was cornered. But in both cases, the problem you had was that a team of bankers, I think led by JP Morgan, had to jump to the rescue and salvage the market. But it was a bit messy, and in the end, they created the Federal Reserve. I know there's lots of conspiracy theories around the Federal Reserve, but honestly, I think it was sort of overdue. Like, especially if you look at the free banking era in the US. I mean, it's very interesting. Some people think it might have worked, or it worked. I mean, sure, it was a little bit, I don't know, I find, you had the same in Scotland, this being said. I mean, maybe, Robbie, we can, at some point expand on that, but there is definitely a case for, when the economy is trying to grow fast, banks are lending, they'll make mistakes. Now, if these mistakes, ripple and amplify and, how do you say, compound, well, you're going to end up in a seriously bad situation, and you want a central bank. You really want a central bank in those times. Imagine managing the COVID crisis without central banks. Okay? Just imagine. So actually, and this is, interestingly, this came up in the whole literature on the Scottish currency debate. I mean, Ronald McDonald, he emphasizes this one. Ian Hardy emphasizes that one. Here I'm talking about only the academics. Obviously, the Commonwealth economics are vastly aware of those things, but just to say, like, this is widely accepted. Now, the point I want to make is that we created central banks for that, and we don't have a replacement for them. Okay, every time, like in the euro area crisis, when we tried to use other governments, to provide financial stability to Greece, I mean, sorry, like it was a little bit costly. Like the central bank could have done it straight. I argue that fighting inflation or unemployment is a very modern creation. To say, oh yeah, that's what central banks are going to do, or contribute to, and making them often the monopoly fighter against inflation. And it's mostly because they believe that if you influence on the quantity of money, you're going to influence prices. I didn't put any chart here, but I could provide you plenty of charts where the quantity of money does this, and prices do that. Okay, it doesn't work. And still today, okay, the main driver of government bond yields is the central bank interest rate. Like, if you want to simplify, government bond yields or central bank interest rate plus a margin, which is usually positive. Now, interestingly, during the COVID period, for euro area countries, for instance, it turned negative. And I think maybe in the UK, you did have some negative yields in the UK? Did you? No? No, okay, right, no. But if you look at countries like France, Germany, the part almost to the maturities from 0 to 10 years turned not only negative, but they went below the central bank rate, which is, from a logical perspective, nonsensical. But it's because central banks had two channels of intervention. They could, on the one hand, set their administered central rates, like the equivalent of the base rate in the UK. And on the other hand, they would, through their balance sheet, they would stimulate the demand for bonds and reduce the yields on those bonds. And what they did is with the latter channel, they maintain rates, well, in the euro area, negative but not too negative. But using the purchase channel, they went super heavy-handed and moved yields into more negative territory than the central rates themselves. Okay, now they've gone back to normal. The yield curve is a little bit more normal looking. Okay, but still, I will argue and I will try to show you with the next two slides that it's not markets, because we love to, that narrative with, oh yes, the markets are anticipating this, so or the government and central bank have to, adapt. No, it's not the case. It doesn't work that way. And it's not the public debt levels, and it's certainly not the rating agencies. Okay, so first chart. On the x-axis, the ratio of public debt, gross public debt to GDP. On the y-axis, the interest rate as I calculated before, so the total interest payments divided by the total public debt. All right, so let's forget Japan for a second. you say, oh yes, there's a positive relationship, right? Undeniably. Right? Okay. If you put all the, it's more like there's no real, but Japan. Okay. Now some people will say, yes, but Japanese people, they hold 95% of their public debt. Well, so do Italians. So what? Okay. So no, it's just because the interest rate in Japan is super low. Has been forever, and they bought so much debt that, well, the average, because that's what I calculated, the average interest rate is low just because of historical reasons. Okay? Now, the US has been increasing. I mean, this is, I won't say worrying because at the end of the day they can always print more dollars, but I'm not saying I side with Trump against Powell, but like make it maybe. But okay, now seriously, the UK, initially I wanted to talk about QT, but I thought I'm going to kill the audience and run out of time. But I'll just say one thing. Like the Bank of England has had one of the most, I'm going on the internet, so maybe I'm going to watch what I'm going to say. Hard to understand strategy in the recent context. So now what do? They decide to sell not just the short-term bonds that redeem, they proactively sell long bonds. So you have something called the duration effect, meaning that longer maturities lose even more values because they purchase those bonds when the rates were low, so prices were high. They sell them when the rates are high, so the bond prices are low. So they make losses, okay? So they create, they reduce the bond prices by selling more. They make more capital losses, okay? They increase the borrowing costs for the government. The government is, filled with chickens, and as a result, they think, oh, we have a negative policy space. We can't. All right, that's the situation. So yes, QT is nonsensical. Like there's nothing to be said in favor of it. And never forget Japan. Now this is the other chart. So the color, okay, is the rating. It's S&P rating. So it's not up to date because if you may know, but last week, very sadly, S&P decided to downgrade France. So 1 minute of silence for my country who's going to die. So, but look, interestingly, okay, yeah, you can say, sure, like this, you'll have more blue, and here you'll have more pink. Yes, but like, okay, Japan, China, okay. And you have some really weird ones, like you have Morocco. Okay, and what I said about Greece, the debt being taken off market, no, it's not the case with Morocco, okay? No, it's just because, so the x-axis is the central bank policy rate. The y-axis is the yield on the 10-year government bond. What you see, okay, and this here is the, the 45-degree line. So literally, it's the average, but you can see that it's pretty linear, and the R square is 83%, which is relatively robust. Okay, and that's obviously an understatement. All it means is that, well, the Moroccan central bank doesn't care about the S&P rating. They put their policy rate at something like 2.5, and, well, they pay 3% on the 10-year. Okay, now, the country that you want to leave is located here. So, rate 4%, 10-year government bond 4.2% at the time. You're borrowing at more than Morocco and Malaysia. Well done, guys. That's an achievement. Yes, all right. What there was to demonstrate. So, the limits of monetary policy specifically against inflation. All right, so let's start with the good. Okay, what works? Because some of it does work, all right? Asset price channels. The first thing that monetary policy will impact are asset prices. I mean, you've all seen during QE, you have a QE, stock prices do that. Right? And clearly bond prices too, because interest rates go down, so on and so forth. So clearly, it works on financial prices. So there's a wealth effect to the extent, and apparently in the US it's a thing, and in the UK probably more. It really depends on the country. I would say in continental Europe it's definitely less strong. But to the extent that people becoming wealthier means that they're going to spend more on consumption, well, yeah, okay, that can have an effect on the economy. And to the extent that more demand brings prices up, that will have an effect on prices. Second channel, housing, okay? Yes, arguably, mortgages are more expensive, people will buy less. At some point, you do that long enough. If you increase interest rates, you're going to kill the construction sector. Okay, that will have an impact on the economy. That will have an impact on the price of various commodities that enter construction, including energy, because construction is quite energy intensive. And ultimately, the price of oil feeds into all the prices in the economy. So yes, monetary policy in some ways works against inflation. The question is how? And if you're trying to reduce the price of bread, well, how much do you have to, bring house prices down, before you pay, less for a pound of bread? And finally, the exchange rate. Okay, it does have an effect on the exchange rate. Now, interestingly, there are two moments in that effect. The first one, let's take the current situation. When the Bank of England either increases or maintains interest rates higher compared to other countries, it is positive for the pound, meaning investors are going to say, well, it's more interesting to hold bonds in the UK. Okay, so they're going to come to the UK. But as time goes on, just because they're lending to the UK government, they don't care about spending in the UK. Okay? They're going to repatriate the money. So the more interest you pay to them, in the longer run, the more it's going to depreciate your currency. So what happens is you have a one-off immediate effect, but the long term, which is smaller, but it's every period for all the maturity, actually goes against your currency. Now, if you look at the GBP against the dollar, at the moment, it's been depreciating, and the euro, it's been depreciating for a year, because you've entered that period when, okay, great, you've borrowed super expensive, it's costing for your poor government who's on the verge of, your nervous breakdown and, heart attack. But on top of that, yeah, now you're depreciating your currency because the income is being repatriated to foreign investors. So it's a two-edged sword. Now, something to consider. There are sectoral asymmetries, and it's pretty important to consider. I'm kind of baffled. There is ample empirical evidence, yet we still teach students by default that when you increase interest rates, people are going to just curtail consumption. Okay, and people who don't have enough income to consume in the first place, they're going to. Are you being serious? No, it's very differentiated. It impacts financial prices first, also housing prices, but most consumption items, the effect is not statistically significant. All right, and that's the thing. Monetary policy, interest rates are supposed to be used to fight inflation, defined not as the change in the price of financial assets, but as the consumer price index. It's a complete mismatch between means and goal. Like if they said, oh, we're going to target housing prices, yeah, that would work better. Consumer prices, you're literally saying, oh, let's try and influence the part of the subset of the overall price level that reacts the least statistically to what we do. I mean, you're really trying to make your life hard. Now, importantly, monetary policy also works the wrong way. And there are two channels for that. Okay, so the first one, don't look at the screen, look at me. You're a company. Wages increase. What do you do with your prices? You increase them. Okay. Second question. The price of energy increases, like oil prices increase. Your energy cost increase. What do you do with your prices? Up. Third question. Your bank decides to charge you more financial cost. What do you do with your prices? Yes, it's called the cost channel. Higher rates means higher prices. Okay, it's a one-off. It will not be continuous, but to the extent that it feeds into other prices, can be delayed in time. Second channel, it's been more and more acknowledged, well, greatly thanks to the, Warren Mosler arguably has been pushing it, and I hear more and more people, they don't cite Mosler, but they do cite this, especially in the context of the US, the income channel. So there are people who pay the interest, but there are people who get the interest, okay? And to a certain extent, it's an income. There may not be a huge propensity to consume on those interest incomes, but they're going to spend some of it. And especially as you accumulate over time, that will be spent at some point. So to a certain extent, it does feed into demand. This one is more on the supply side. This one is more on the demand side. Now, I'm sure you'll believe me, you do not really see any mention of those existing and documented channels on central bank websites. You do find it in the old central bank research papers, but at no point on the official pages about monetary policy channels are they mentioned. So that's the state of the situation. You have central banks that try to affect the part of the price level that they target the less. They can directly target the less, and you can have some like counterbalancing effects. Just, food for thought. So possible replacement could include, and here I'm really saying, well, look, if you're going to create a new state, new central bank, well, you do what you want with your monetary policy framework. There literally will not be anyone to tell you what to do. Okay, so that's definitely something. You have this fantastic space, to think about what to do when you launch the thing. So let's just very simply distinguish two possibilities: demand-led inflation, supply-led inflation. When you have demand-led inflation, well, typically, you want to increase the, anything that's going to reduce disposable income. Because if you think it's demand-led, so income tax, that's the one historically in the post-war period, that's what we would do, increase income tax. To the extent, especially if it's inflation related to housing, okay, well, then maybe the interest rates make sense. But if inflation is driven by, the price of, fruit and vegetables, as opposed to cars, because cars can be bought on finance, well, fruit and vegetables, I have a hard time believing you'll achieve anything with the interest rate. Okay? All the more as, on top of that, it's something which is vital for people. So even if you reduce their disposable income, I would argue, they will probably still spend on food, and curtail other spending. Okay? So sometimes there might even be inflation that you cannot really fight, in which case, maybe actually subsidies would be the way. But the other possibility is supply-side inflation. So this has come to the fore in recent years because, COVID, supply chain disruptions, war in Ukraine, higher oil prices. Like central banks say it, well, these are supply-side shocks. That's why initially central banks didn't react. They said, we're trying to see through. Well, they were very unlucky. It has to be said that Vladimir Putin decided to invade, his backyard. In the immediate aftermath of the COVID crisis, it created this sort of like, two things. And at some point, not to lose their credibility, they had to intervene. Did they make a difference? Not really, because if you look at the inflation dynamics, what happened is it started going down for purely mathematical reasons. Because if you increase the price, you have an inflation, obviously. But once the price stays the same, well, 2 years later, by definition, inflation is zero. Okay? Your prices are still higher than before, but and it's mathematical. It's called the base effect. And most of the reason why inflation went down is due to that mathematical effect called the base effect, which, a 12-year-old can understand. So, but nonetheless, there are tools against supply-side inflation, especially when these are recurring or when they could propagate to different parts of the economy, particularly energy shocks. One of them is subsidies, which the IMF relabeled unconventional fiscal policies. Yeah, but it's true. And no, by the way, and I'm not kidding, I used the term 2 months before the IMF published their thing. It's in it's called Junge Welt. It's a Marxist German newspaper. I was kind of inspired. It must have been like in the zeitgeist to use that in the conclusion, but it was not like in an academic thing. And 2 months later, I see the IMF. So I don't know, have I been unconsciously influenced or, but I would argue, like, it's not bad. It's a bit, catchy. But the idea is, usually fiscal policy, if you increase demand, if you increase spending, it's deemed to be inflationary, right, through the demand channel. Here the idea is you increase government spending, but actually you exert a deflationary influence through the cost channel. And the IMF, in their 2023 paper, so it's Lee and Quarters, did argue that this actually impacted prices like negatively, so reduced inflation, more than monetary policy in Europe. They said it. So it's official. These subsidies work better against supply-side inflation. So literally, in that case, central banks are useless. We should have government spend more in the form of subsidies. Well, obviously, when you give them, deficit and debt targets, there's going to be an issue at some point. Because that's what France did, okay? France went heavy-handed. I'm not saying that the way they designed was super good. They put notably a subsidy per liter. What happened? A liter of fuel at the pump, which means that people with SUVs, would go and get huge subsidies on their cars. Maybe it would have been better to give like a, how do you say, lump sum to everybody or something, to subsidize more specifically, I meant. But the problem that France now has is, if you think about it, France spent more, okay, so it increased deficit, it increased public debt, and at the same time it limited inflation. So the public debt to GDP ratio of France has doubly suffered because of those policies. Okay? They increased the numerator and they did not allow the denominator to increase as much, which would have reduced the overall ratio. So basically now you have this crisis, this fiscal crisis in France, which is a complete joke. Okay? We have a political crisis, without a doubt. People say Macron should, resign, and that's, sounds sensible, but he's not going to do it. So we're going to have a, proper political crisis for another 18 to 20 months. But on the fiscal front, now we're fine. I mean, at the end of the day, come on. I mean, let alone the fact we're, nuclear power with all the geopolitical weight it carries. I mean, unlike Greece, unlike the UK, we have borders with 8 countries. Okay, like the day we decide to make some noise, we can cut, trade between countries and all. Let's be serious, okay? Nothing is going to happen, all right? It's all in our heads. But basically, subsidies worked in France. Okay, and France and Spain. And it's not a surprise that the countries, with the exception of Japan and Switzerland, with completely different countries, but the countries that recorded the least inflation at the peak were France and Spain, who implemented the most those measures. So they work. So basically what you need to think is, okay, what do we want to achieve? What is the nature of the shock? Let's do it. Let's not care too much about the public debt. The other possible tools include strategic stocks of commodities, like the US do with their oil reserve, strategic reserve. And it's not going to work in the short run, but in the long run, you need to think industrial policy. Like when you have supply chains, you need to be serious, okay? And it's very general. I'm thinking about food, thinking about tech-related things. Yeah, don't let bottlenecks, create random inflationary shocks. Like if that can be avoided, do it. And as a result, once you've designed tools to mitigate inflation, just let central banks focus on providing financial stability. Thank you very much. I guess I've completely exceeded, but hey. All right.
I think it's quite obvious that you've just spent an hour in the company of one of the world's experts on monetary policy and exchange rates. So I hope you found it illuminating, and that when we get the final report next year with the recommendations for what we should actually do in Scotland as we become independent, then you'll know that those have been prepared by somebody who actually knows what he's talking about. So we don't have very long for questions. I think I'll take a couple, but they were going to have the sort of buffet for those who are staying ready at 5:30, so we don't want to let it all go too cold. So we'll just have maybe 3 or 4 questions. John.
I would like to ask.
Hang on a minute.
I would like to ask you, what's your view on the governor of the Bank of England? When I read his book, he said he's only got inflation, interest rates to counteract inflation, and unemployment is a necessary evil.
Mm-hmm. Should I reply straight away? Okay, so 2 things. I'm really not a massive fan of the current governor of the Bank of England. I'm not remotely going to try and hide it. Okay, there are 2 things to say. The first one is generally, you don't need to have this inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. And in recent times, we haven't seen the need to reduce to increase unemployment to reduce inflation. And I would actually argue that sometimes when you stimulate your economy, you have that thing called increasing returns to scale. So when economies expand, companies expand, they can reduce their unit cost. They can actually reduce their prices. That's how companies grow, basically. So in that case, if you do that, if you do it well, over the long run, you should actually observe, if you do it well, you could even observe an increase in employment and a reduction of stabilization, reduction of inflation. So now, obviously, it's a short-term trade-off we're talking about. Depends the nature of the inflation. Okay, but the second thing that I want to say, because I'm very lucky to have been able to read a report by David Barnes at the London School of Economics, who has informed a recent speech or piece by an op-ed by Swati Dhingra, who's one of the members of the current Monetary Policy Committee. I think she's the only non-British member of the MPC. It's interesting if you compare the British inflation and the Irish or European inflation. There's 1%, give or take, but we roughly have the same baskets. Okay, the thing that changes is the weight. And interestingly, you may know there's currently an issue in Africa. In Western Africa, there's a drought, and this has affected the price of chocolate. What turns out is the coefficient, so it's very technical, but the coefficient of chocolate in the British consumption basket is higher than it is in Europe. So for that reason, that particular supply side phenomenon, okay, which happens in Africa, okay, impacts inflation more in the UK than it does in the euro area. Now my question is, how does the overnight rate on the interbank market in the UK, how is it going to solve a drought in Western Africa? If you have an answer. Yes, no, so I don't think what they're doing is very sensible. And on top of that, what I described, the cost channel, yeah, I think it's playing big time in the UK. I do think this country has reached a point where typically landlords are starting to pass through interest through rents to tenants. And yes, it is problematic. They should cut rates. They should massively cut rates and stop that nonsense. Yes.
You've just highlighted how terrible monetary policy is in terms of its desired effect on the economy. So why do we not just get rid of it at all and have 0% rate on interest and try and manage inflation through a full employment policy? Now, you know that's the two likely recommendations that will come out of the paper that Warren and I are writing, but could you argue against that or for that, please?
The truth is I don't have any strong argument against that. As far as economic incentives and all are concerned, I mean, the argument that I hear, I can't remember, I do think he's a British commentator, a very erudite man who said, yes, it's really an issue that the price of money, okay, has gone down so much because it's feeding into people's impatience. I don't know, I just don't think that, people are just watching the interest rate on their, smartphone and thinking, oh my God, it's gone down, like 0.1%, I'm going to, buy 3 more pairs of shoes. And in general, I mean, in the UK, like you had a very, I mean, at the end of the day, we should be at complete full employment and we should be completely overheating the economy if it really was true that, people spend like animals when interest rates are too low. So I would be very sympathetic, at least from a scientific perspective, as an experiment. Maybe the only thing I wonder is it fair, at least for a portion of savings, of monetary savings, to say to people, we're going to sort of, it's an insurance against inflation, if you wish. So should you do that, but like targeted, or saying just the first X, pounds or whatever? But no, I don't have any strong counter argument against your proposal.
Another one, back.
You mentioned Ronald McDonald a few times in your presentation. His view is that an independent Scotland would require its own currency because it would need to devalue quite substantially. Do you agree with Ronald on that?
Well, that's interesting because depending on the paper you read, it doesn't say exactly the same thing. It does say that on the whole, but what I want to emphasize is if you remember my slide with the 5 different dimensions, one of them, he talks about a managed float or a crawling peg. He may even talk about a crawling band. And then he says against a basket consisting of different currencies. And again, if at some point GBP does that, or like GBP does that, dollar does that, you're using an average of the two, well, you'll be depreciating against the GBP, but it still follows your... Now, what you're talking about is what will have to happen. Okay, I'm going to put it that way. Right now, what are the industries, the sectors in Scotland that would immediately benefit from a devaluation or depreciation of a Scottish pound? I think there are some, but there could be more. So I just wonder if it is, there are days where I agree. And there are days where I think, you know what, markets are so unpredictable, and there may be, you know, variables that I'm not catching in my reasoning, and I try to be as exhaustive as possible, but you can't, you know, turn every stone to check. It is a possibility, I'm not going to lie. But at the end of the day, you know, there's so much is going to go down before people start thinking, okay, now it's only going to go up. And maybe it's going to be very fast, it's going to depreciate very fast, and then it will just keep appreciating. And you know what? People don't look at the past. They will just think, okay, now it's going up. So at some point, they will start repatriating and even maybe speculating upwards. It's very hard to predict this kind of thing. I mean, in my PhD, I reviewed the, that was 5 years ago, but I can tell you not much has changed. If anything, it's probably worse. I reviewed the different forecasting model for exchange rates. I mean, the short story is none of them works. So yeah, the day you float or anything can happen. The yield curve doesn't, the interest rate difference between countries, the fundamentals of the economy, no. It so depends. You know, it may be that your particular maturity structure, there may be one day where you have a lot of repayments at the same time. It's going to have a technical impact. It may be that all of a sudden people, you know, decide to repatriate. The question is how many people from Scotland will decide to repatriate to Scotland, because you have basically an exogenous movement of wealth that, by the way, is not captured in the balance of payment, that will actually, in that case, strengthen the financial resilience of Scotland. There's the whole question of, at this stage, I don't have any precise figure, but it is quite clear that, okay, state pension, you would argue it will be paid by the Scottish government, but all the private pensions, there will still be flows coming from the UK. That would, you know, push up. It's the net right now. I don't have the data to give you a. I will never, like, you know, say, oh, I can definitely tell you it's going to be that anyway. But I, even at this stage, lack the data to remotely answer your question with a, you know, 10% of the precision I think you would ask for.
Take one more if there is one. Yes, lady here.
Yes, we're told by successive governments that the Bank of England is independent. And I would say that they use that as an excuse for inaction because they don't actually know economics at all. So what would be the situation in Scotland? Would we determine that the Bank of Scotland is independent, or would we actually admit that it is actually a tool of government? And one of the reasons I think it's particularly important is that I never voted for the Bank of England.
So I have quite a few friends or acquaintances that work in central banks, and like there's what they, well, first of all, I know that every time I say something like that, which ends up on the internet, that probably reduces my probability of getting a job at a central bank in the future. So this being said, I do have friends at central banks, and you're very policed when you work for a central bank, and some of them say things in private that they obviously cannot say. I would say that there are even economists in central banks that think that central bank independence doesn't work. And I would say there's a growing view. I'm not saying it's a consensus, far from it, but there's a growing view that central bank independence is a kind of luxury that we afforded at one point in time. Clearly, it's almost by definition compatible with high levels of debt, because high level of debt will require, compare the Japanese case, to maintain artificially low levels of interest, or like, as William's saying, just bring them to zero. But there is, so independence, the narrative for independence is you can't trust governments because they're going to spend too much, they're going to use monetary creation that's going to spur inflation. Again, Japan. If you look from 1991 to today, well, they've consistently run a deficit. And by the way, if you look from a sectoral balance perspective, they had a current account surplus most of the time. They run a deficit, meaning the private sector is gorging, like their saving is like through the roof. But they have significant fiscal deficits. The central bank not only buys government bonds, it's also the main buyer of ETFs to maintain the whole private pension system afloat, okay? And have you seen inflation in Japan? No. So, right, so basically the rationale is there. And one last thing I'm going to add, you have probably heard about the Weimar inflation, and the official story is, oh, the Germans, spent too much money. The central bank was printing money like there was no tomorrow. No, what happened is there was speculation on the exchange rate. That fed into imported inflation, which fed into domestic inflation. And the central bank, when people go to their bank, they need to borrow. When companies produce and the price of what they need to buy has increased, they need more credit. So you need more money. So the causality went that way. And actually, the state-of-the-art method for it, one of the methods is called the Granger causality test. So there are issues with that. I'm not going to discuss it. But the point is, in that particular episode, all the tests are absolutely clear. The causality, the Granger statistical causality, went from prices to money, not money to prices. So it was actually exchange rate, prices, money. Okay? And it was documented at the time by some of the greatest economists alive, including Albert Aftalion. Now we've rewritten the whole history. It doesn't make sense. Then we say, oh, it's because of that Nazis arrived in power. That was 10 years later, and in between there was deflation. But my point is, the Bundesbank was independent at the time. Okay?
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll join with me in thanking Professor Laurentjoye for all he's been doing.